Here we go with the NCR 507 lecture on interviews. As an NCRP practitioner, you will use interviews for several divergent purposes: for research, conflict resolution process intake, and for professional vetting processes. First, interviews can be used to collect detailed information about conflicts and resolution processes. Research interviews can explore the variables or causes of conflicts. Second, mediation services and other conflict resolution processes often interview clients during case development. Also, many consumer advocacy groups and states have a list of questions on how to select the best mediator. And third, structured behavioral interviews are used to screen potential employees. I will go over these three broad areas of interviews for NCRP and then discuss your interview assignment. I have helped design several research projects which included interviews. One was for my dissertation. My research question was, what is the impact of foreign-trained teachers on students learning in a California school district? I interviewed the district's human resource director, director of research and evaluation, and 6 principals who supervise teachers recruited from the Philippines. The interviews helped me gather information about how to measure impact on student learning. The interviews helped me define the experiment group of foreign-trained teachers and control group, which was California native teachers trained through the district internship program. I then interviewed and surveyed 50 teachers recruited from the Philippines and 30 teachers trained through the district internship program. In addition to interviews, I looked at principal evaluations of the teachers, student standardized test scores, teacher basic educational skills and subject matter proficiency scores, and teacher attendance and retention rates. The initial interviews with the Director of Human Resources and the Director of Research and Evaluation provided the most useful information to develop the interview guides for principals and then teachers. When I saw patterns in the responses, I created the teacher survey to collect quantitative data. I was able to use the responses in the interviews for narrative content in the final dissertation. This week I am creating a different type of interview guide. The dispute resolution service I volunteer at as president of the board has 2 open positions: a mediation coordinator and an executive director. I have redesigned the job descriptions, and I am creating an interview guide to select the best candidate from a pool of applicants. These positions are specialized, and we have grant obligations and interorganizational commitments that must be met by the future employees. I've integrated these responsibilities into the job descriptions. I am developing interview questions that are aligned with the necessary skills, a list of responses that we are looking for from the candidates, and a rating scale to determine which candidate will most likely succeed in the position. According to Moore, in the mediation process, structured interviews are designed to collect the same or similar information from each of the disputants so their answers are quantifiable and comparable. This requires a list of standardized questions or categories of questions. Non-structured interviews are used for exploratory data collection if the same information is not required from each disputant. If there may be resistance to structure by the interviewee, or if the mediator has not accumulated enough information to narrow down the focus to specific categories or questions. Semi-structured interviews blend elements of both structured and unstructured interviews. In this table, I also threw in some of Jerome Sadler's contrast between a clinical assessment interview and a casual conversation. The steps of planning an interview vary with the purpose of the interview. When I am conducting interviews for special education eligibility, I identify and schedule a time with the parent, teacher, and student. If the student is already receiving services and it is a reevaluation, I will add specialists such as special education teachers, the speech pathologist, an occupational therapist, a physical therapist, a counselor, or a school nurse to my list of specialists to interview. I usually don't have to create an interview guide because the profession of school psychology already has many pre-validated disability-specific interview guides and protocols, so I just have to pick among the correct one. According to Moore, there are two types of interviews: data collection interviews and persuasive interviews. Researchers and neutral third parties in an NCRP process usually focus on the data collection interviews, whereas negotiators may focus on persuasive interviews. According to Whipple, there are two kinds of interviewers: those who think there are two kinds of interviewers and those who don't. You should look for people in the positions who may have insight into answering the question. Recognized experts with a positive reputation for solving problems, the decision makers, or experts in conflict resolution. You want to avoid the opinionated commentators who provide oversimplified and legally questionable solutions to complex problems. You have learned how to build rapport with clients through the NCRP program. Some specific suggestions by Moore to build rapport during interviews are explaining the importance of the data to be collected, stressing the need to hear all the views, explaining the benefits of participation, answering questions that may decrease resistance to participation, and demonstrating a positive personal interest in the disputant's concerns, problems, or viewpoints. Most research texts advocate using open-ended questions for interviews. Closed-ended questions are more efficiently asked through surveys, polls, and questionnaires. This table shows the main differences between closed and open-ended questions. Closed-ended questions can be answered with a simple yes or no. The responses are shorter and easier to analyze. They can be administered by the novice interviewer, research assistant, or mediation case development, and usually involve a range of limited choices. Open-ended questions help explore clients' positions and underlying interest. They allow clients to share their emotions and elaborate on different options. They reveal the depth of the client's knowledge and experience. They provide an opportunity for the client to reconstruct events or give details. And the client may generate their own answers without limited options. All the different types of questions leads me to something my professor in research, design, and execution, Dr. David Nassiter, told me when I was an instructional assistant in this program. I asked him, how do I respond to questions from students that I don't know the answer to? He told me to give the students one of three responses. First, it is empirically obvious. Second, it is beyond the scope of this class. Or third, that would be a great research project for you to investigate. The different types of questions include elaboration questions, questions tied to the active listening process, direct and indirect clarification questions, summary questions, confrontation questions, questions of repetition, reflective questions, and questions that check for understanding of the other party's interest. The different types of questions have lots of overlap. On this table, I have provided the types of questions, the definitions, and an example of each question. Some research texts have longer lists of types of questions. I have narrowed down and selected types of questions and given examples that are applicable to NCRP. The types of questions to avoid are listed in your textbooks in the eBrary. I am not aware of any NCRP specific questions to avoid. Yes/no questions are more efficiently answered in surveys, although you can ask these closed-ended questions during interviews. The other questions are just difficult to code and categorize into useful summaries. Moving on to coding responses, Barbara Matanick uses a profile element grid in her book, I Hear What You Say, But What Are You Telling Me, to code responses during the conflict resolution process. This can also be used to code responses during interviews about conflicts and resolution processes. She includes different elements in her grid, such as system, initiation, mental movement, validation, rationale, decision factors, time frame, thinking, focus, affiliation, preference, and placement. I added vision and locus of control to the grid. During my interviews, I differentiate between clients who believe things aren't working and they want to see a transformational change, and the interviewees with a transactional view who say things need to stay status quo or as they are. Locus of control differentiates between interviewees with an internal locus who believe they can facilitate happenstance, compared with the interviewees who believe they are the victim of external systematic circumstances. Questions can be used to make a decision. These questions come from the Alaska Guide for Selecting a Mediator. I have provided a copy of this document in the Blackboard materials as an example of an interview guide. Fatoto included in his interview guide as an appendix to explore workplace conflict. I will post this article in Blackboard so you can see how data can be used in a semi-structured interview to answer a research question. Enosh and Buckbinder, in their article, The Interactive Construction of Narrative Styles in Sensitive Interviews, use a semi-structured interview format and analysis technique. The interviewer transcribed the questions and answers and then indexed categories of responses to compare with responses from other interviewees. I will also post this article on Blackboard. I selected an example of a structured behavioral interview for employment that includes mediation, problem solving, and negotiation skills from the Washington Department of Personnel. You can use a similar guide and process for academic research, gathering information about conflicts, program evaluations, and when developing interview questions for potential employees. In the structured interview, you often use backward mapping, where you are looking at a person who has the correct answers or ideas to complex problems. You would brainstorm the possible answers, create a rating guide or rubric, and then design the questions, get the answers that support or nullify your hypothesis. The field of psychology has many clinically validated structured interviews protocols, such as the child and adolescent psychiatric assessment and the schedule for affective disorders and schizophrenia for school-age children. I haven't been able to find studies using structured interviews related to NCRP. If you know of some, please post them in the discussion board. Your interview assignment involves analyzing your research question and generating 7 to 10 variables that would indicate a satisfactory solution. Transform your variables into a list of open-ended interview questions. Then identify a list of possible responses, a response coding system, or rating guide. This is to describe how you will summarize multiple interview responses or use the responses to create a survey to collect a larger sample. You will then test or validate your interview questions with 3 NCRP experts. These experts are your classmates. You can do this through the phone, Skype, or face-to-face. Your final product should be a 1 to 2 page semi-structured or structured interview guide describing the purpose of the interview, a list of interview questions, a coding or rating system, and a summary of how you validated the questions. You should also provide a note about the optimal interviewees to provide insight into finding a satisfactory solution to your research question. And if you can find a pre-existing survey that provides variables that will answer your research question, I encourage you to go ahead and use it. Many of you have research questions that won't have a lot of studies or pre-existing surveys for or interview guides, so you will have to construct them yourself. I look forward to reading your interview guides.